Good morning, everyone. I see you, Mr. Cooper. I call the meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting number 85, the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to study the question of privilege related to the member for Wellington, Halton Hills, and other members. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before we begin with the witness, I just want to note that I had put on notice a motion that I wish to I believe will be taken up during committee business. It's been circulated. I presume all members have copies with them, and I would just ask through you, Madam Chair, that before we go in camera, I would like to read into the record the motion. I will also be putting forward a motion that committee business for the third hour of this meeting and the meeting scheduled for this evening be in public.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. So just to clarify, we're going to have our first panel and our second panel, and then when we return from a quick pause for the third hour of today's meeting, you would like the floor in public to put your motion on the record, and you would also like members to consider whether we can not be in a camera for the business portion of it. So maybe we don't have to put forward a motion on that part. We can just get to agreement by the third hour. Is that okay?
I would hope we could reach agreement.
Mr. Cooper, I hope we can reach agreement too, but you already signaled that you would like to meet tonight. So I will maintain my optimism.
I hope we don't have to meet tonight, but if we do, we do, and if we do, it should be in public.
Well, if that your motion is to not meet tonight, then I would be seconding that motion, but we're not there yet. So, Mr. Cooper, you will have the floor at the top of the third hour. With that, we have with us today, from the United Kingdom House of Commons, Eve Sampson, Clerk of the Journals, who is joining us by video conference. Ms. Sampson, welcome to Procedure and House Affairs. Thank you for your response and taking us up on this offer. We are really excited to be with you today, and I believe you have an opening statement, so the floor is yours. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for inviting me to appear. As the Clerk of the Journals in the United Kingdom House of Commons, I'm the House's expert on parliamentary privilege. I do also know something about our administrative practices, but other witnesses may be better able to speak about them. And I think I want to start by saying that the privileges of the Canadian House are, of course, very closely linked to the privileges of the House of Commons here, but it's important to remember your privileges will have evolved in subtly different ways. One thing that I found surprising was that the Canadian House of Commons has waived its privilege of freedom of speech to allow courts and inquiries to look at proceedings. We consider that as Article 9 of the Bill of Rights is enshrined in statute, it cannot be waived. I understand from your proceedings that various matters have arisen, whether intimidation of a member is a contempt, committee powers to demand confidential papers, and the power to summon witnesses. Here, if I understand it correctly, the committee is considering such matters as powers against those outside the Canadian jurisdiction. And I can go into more detail in answer to questions, but to turn to each in turn. In paragraph 15.2, Erskine May states that any act or omission which obstruct or impedes either House of Parliament in the performance of its functions, or which obstructs or impedes any member or officer of such House in the discharge of their duty, or which has a tendency, directly or indirectly, to produce such results, may be treated as a contempt, even though there is no precedent of the offence. So intimidating a member is certainly capable of being treated as a contempt, and Erskine May gives numerous examples of when it has been treated as such. Most committees in the United Kingdom House of Commons have power to call for persons, papers and records. In practice, they do not need to use these powers. They discuss matters with particular witnesses and agree consensually. When this does not work, the committee can agree an order to attend or to produce papers. If the order is not obeyed, the committee itself has no power to enforce it. It must report to the House, which itself may then make an order. It is, however, difficult for the House to enforce its orders against anyone other than a member of the House. In theory, it has powers to imprison, but has been explored by our Committee of Privileges quite recently. Its procedures do not meet modern expectations of the way in which such punishments should be inflicted, and in practice, it has confined itself to admonishment. Our Committee of Privileges has made proposals for such contempts to be handled by the courts, but there isn't much progress on that matter. The House's powers to order documents are, however, effective against government. In recent years, on several occasions, the House has agreed motions for returns to force the government to release documents either by laying them by the House or, where papers were sensitive, laying them before a committee. In 2018, the House fined ministers in contempt for their failure to comply with the requirements of the motion for return passed on 13th November that year to publish the final and full legal advice provided by the Attorney General to the Cabinet concerning the EU withdrawal agreement and the framework for the future relationship. When they passed that motion, the legal advice was provided. It's notable that one order provided for papers to be made available to committees or members on a confidential basis, and another anticipated that redactions might be made solely for the purposes of national security. Another set of papers was provided with redactions made to protect the identity of officials in email chains, and this was not challenged. So to sum up, yes, intimidation could be considered contempt. Committees and the House have power to call for papers, but there can be practical barriers to enforcing their orders, and the House itself can decide to call for papers in ways which allow for limited access to those papers.
Thank you. With that, we'll get into our 6-minute rounds of questions. We'll start with Mr. Cooper, followed by Monsieur Fergus, puis Madame Goudreau, and Mrs. Blaney to end off the first round. Mr. Cooper, through the chair, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witness. I'm going to ask some questions that may be slightly outside your realm. However, as a clerk of the House of Commons, I would presume you would be able to answer in general terms to provide this committee with an understanding of how the UK's Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament works. Would you be able to do that?
I can give you some very high-level indications.
And my questions would be high level.
Let us try. If I can't answer, I will say so.
Okay. And I raise this because the member for Wellington Halton Hills, who was targeted by the Beijing regime when he came before this committee, cited the UK's Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament as a committee that is, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but essentially a gold standard, at least in comparison to what we have in Canada. And it was one of his recommendations to this committee that such a committee modeled on the UK be established here in Canada. We have the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. Unlike the UK's committee, it is not a standing committee of Parliament, and therefore does not have the power to compel witnesses or the power to produce papers. It also does not set its own agenda. And so perhaps as a starting point, could you explain how the committee in the UK works, including whether the committee has a right to set its own agenda, who sits on that committee, how they are vetted before they sit on that committee, and who is responsible for what powers the committee has, and who is responsible for redactions having regard for national security considerations.
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that the Intelligence and Security Committee is an odd hybrid. It is a statutory committee. It is not a normal parliamentary committee. I've been hastily looking for the statute under which it's set up, which will give its powers. So it isn't like an ordinary parliamentary committee where the powers are derived from parliamentary privilege. They are powers derived from statute. The other thing that should be said is that there is a great deal of government control over the committee. When I say government control, I don't mean that in any, how shall I put it? I don't mean that in any pejorative way, but what I mean is that because the committee has access to very, very confidential material, it has limitations. It publishes matters. Only with the consent of the Prime Minister. I have found it, and if you'll excuse me, and I'm sorry for this, I will refresh my memory. So it can request information that does not relate to a particular operation matter or to something that the ISC is considering under the Act. And the person for whom it is requested has power to inform the ISC the information cannot be disclosed because the Secretary of State has decided it would not be disclosed. So its disclosure powers are not unlimited. And if it receives information in private, it can only publish reports, publish information by way of a report under Section 3 of the Act, which, sets, forgive me, I'm having to dart around a little, which has to be sent to the Prime Minister first, and the Prime Minister must exclude any matter from any report to Parliament if the Prime Minister, after consultation with the Intelligence and Security Committee, considers that the matter would be prejudicial to the continued discharge of the functions of the security service. And the transparency there is that if such material is removed, then the ISC report will indicate whether it has been so removed. And if things are redacted, then the ISC may report on them to the Prime Minister. So it's an excellent committee, and it does make matters public. It does have access to a large degree of sensitive information, but it does so in a statutory framework. And its remit is to examine or otherwise oversee the expenditure, administration, policy, and operations of the Security Service, the Secret Intelligence Service, and the Government Communications Headquarters, and such other matters, activities of Her Majesty's government in relation to intelligence or security matters as are set out in a memorandum of understanding.
Thank you. Yes. So we have 6-minute rounds and about 24 seconds ago. Don't be sorry. We appreciate you being here. Before I go to Mr. Fergus, we have 25 minutes left in the bells. What I believe we have agreement on is to continue with our committee up until 5 minutes before the bells. Anyone who wants to go vote in the House may, and then when we have everyone back, up to 10 minutes after the vote is determined, we will continue. So we can get through the 6-minute rounds for sure. We might be able to get the first 5-minute round in. If not, we will just adjust accordingly. The next session will still commence at noon. So we'll go with that. Agreement? Excellent. Mr. Fergus, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'd like to also thank Ms. Sampson for being here today and listening to your answer to my colleague, Mr. Cooper. It sounds that there's a great similarity between your ISC as well as our Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. Ms. Sampson, I'm wondering if you could walk us through, in a relatively brief time, as to the current process on how, or regarding how you inform members of Parliament, how you inform them regarding foreign interference, or that they might be a subject of foreign interference. Would you be able to walk us through that?
I'm afraid that's outside my area of expertise. It would be something done by the Director of Security, who I understand your committee wishes to see.
Indeed. Does the House of Commons play a role then in ensuring the protection of members of Parliament and Lords against foreign interference?
Our security team would doubtless do such things. There is, I think, members of Parliament, the Chinese ambassador was told that he was no longer, permitted to enter the precincts. Other matters, I think, are not something I have operational sight of. So I think it would be sensible for me not to try to speculate.
Ms. Sampson, does the House then offer any specific training to detect any foreign interference, offer this training to members of Parliament, to Lords, to their staff?
We have training on things like cybersecurity, which show them. We will react if there are pressure through social media and the like. And on other matters, I think that is probably best that you ask Alison Giles rather than myself.
This is fascinating. So I guess I'm trying to figure out really what is the coordination between the House of Commons, if at all, and your security and intelligence agencies in terms of providing protection to members of Parliament.
There is coordination.
Go ahead.
There is. I think it is reasonable to say that there are conversations that happen, but those are the conversations with Alison and I suspect that this is not something that one would wish to discuss in an open session.
Fair enough. I guess I'm not looking for any operational details. I'm just trying to figure out if there is a coordination between the security and intelligence forces and
there are certainly conversations, as there are conversations between we have the security department, which Alison heads, and the police will, there are contacts clearly.
Indeed. When, in a way, to protect the precinct, to protect the staff, to protect the elected and named representatives of Parliament, how has your role, or how has this role evolved over the last 15 years? And in particular, I'm trying to think of, there was a lot of speculation in the media in terms of Russian interference in the Brexit debate. What type of lessons have you been able to learn and that you've been able to share as a baseline with members of the House of Commons and the Lords?
I think it is difficult to speak about this with much specificity in the open. Remember that there are multiple types of foreign interference, such as cybersecurity, such as interference on social false flag operations on social media, straightforward intimidation, and, if you like, economic manipulation. On economic manipulation, um, you know, trying to persuade members or lords to do things in Parliament for financial gain. That isn't a matter so much about foreign interference, that goes far wider. The House has rules about that. They are enforced. We have lay members on our Committee of Standards. Obviously, this, you know, to stop something, you have to find out that it happens, but there is no sign that this is particularly happening. On cybersecurity, yes, obviously, this is something we take seriously. Social media, I believe there's guidance and training available. And I think, as I say, on other things, you're best to talk to Alison.
Thank you, Ms. Sampson. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madame Goudreau. Ms. Sampson, without trying to assume, the time it will take for interpretation would not be taken away from the member's time. So please do hear the interpretation out before responding. Unless you would prefer to respond in French, then you're welcome to do that as well. But otherwise, whatever official language of Canada of your choice is welcome. Madame Goudreau.
You would not like my French.
You'd be surprised. We encourage everyone to try to speak as much as they can. So maybe for the next meeting, though, because we have a vote in a bit. Madame Goudreau.
Good afternoon, Madam Clerk. We will take the time to speak slowly so that you understand what I am saying. Through you, Madam Chair, I would like first of all to be sure that in the explanation about the protocol, when there is a notice of a threat through your CSIS, is it sent to the Prime Minister or to the Speaker of the House? That is when your ISC warns of some event.
I think this is not something which I operationally deal with, but it isn't the role of the ISC to warn of threats to Parliament in that matter. Its role is to oversee the security services. As I say, I think this is better discussed in private, and I think you will get better answers from my colleague Alison Giles.
Et ma question était...
Well, who receives, first of all, the information when your equivalent of our CSIS, that is the ISC, feels that it is important to be shared? Is it the Prime Minister or is it the Speaker of the House?
I would imagine that it would be the director of our security services, but these are not things on which I have detailed knowledge.
D'accord.
All right. I have another question. When you speak about making public the results of an inquiry further to any potential sanction, what do you really mean when you say you make things public?
Are you talking about ISC inquiries or House of Commons Select Committee inquiries?
Les deux, qu'est-ce qui est rendu?
Both, please. What makes them public? For the ISC,
that is negotiated, with the Prime Minister, and then the ISC will lay its report before Parliament and publish it. You can find their reports on the internet, and that report will say whether or not there are redactions. So that's the process for the ISC. A House of Commons committee will always report in public. There is no facility, I believe, for a solely House of Commons committee to report privately. It will report to the House and publish it. What it might not do is publish the material on which it has relied. It will publish as much as it can so that people can understand why it's come to its conclusions, but it might redact some matters.
OK. Tantôt,
Earlier, Madam Clerk, you did mention that intimidation is a clear contempt in terms of parliamentary privilege. I'd like to hear some of the examples that have occurred in your parliament and now form part of the case law, similar to what we are dealing with here.
I cannot think of one relating to foreign interference except for the matter of sanctions against UK members of parliament who had criticised China. In that case, it wasn't dealt with as a contempt. It was a state-level action, and the response was to make clear that the Chinese ambassador was no longer welcome, although other members of the embassy are permitted to enter the precincts. So at the state level, it was not treated as a contempt. And it's hard to see how it could have been because it depends on someone being in the jurisdiction, and there is a particular sensitivity about diplomatic staff. In principle, the House of Commons powers to take action against them are unlimited. In practice, they are at liberty to leave the jurisdiction, and in exercising those powers, you would invite members to think very carefully about the framework of the Vienna Convention, which is supranational law, and about the possible implication for UK diplomats abroad. So, as I say, that sanctioning of UK members of Parliament for what they'd said in Parliament was not taken through the contempt jurisdiction. In terms of intimidation, which was dealt with as a contempt, the most recent attempt was somebody saying they would take legal action against a member for what they had said if they repeated what they had said in the House. Other similar contempts were saying that you'd withdraw funding for activities in a member's constituencies, or that you would affect selection. So not much of our case law goes to foreign intimidation.
une question avec une réponse.
A question with a yes or no answer. According to your procedures, does Parliament have a possibility of disclosing or not that a member of Parliament is the subject of intimidation? Yes or no?
OK, merci.
Ms. Sampson, I think that was the first time that somebody was asked a yes or no question and we received it. That was excellent. Thank you. Mrs. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and I thank the witness for being here with us today. And thank you for having this discussion about a challenge for many different levels of our other governments across the planet that is looking at this new view. And of course, you in your role, having to figure out the procedure within the House. I appreciate very much your dedication and work. So one of the things that we are really seized with in this process that we're going through around foreign interference in our elections and how it impacts directly some of the members of Parliament in our system is trying to figure out how to get information shared with us in a way that we can access some of it, but also recognizing we have to respect top secret information and, of course, making sure that we keep our partnerships strong with different countries that share information with us. So one of the questions that I have, and I believe you've talked about it a little bit with one of the previous questioners, is just if you can share any information that you have of how information is shared when it is very top secret within your system, but also if there is ever a history where any other department within the House of Commons takes information from, for example, for us it would be CSIS, and reviews it. So the example that I'm thinking of particularly here in Canada is we've had an offering that the law clerk within the House of Commons receive the information and review that information, and that their office decides which should be redacted and which should not be. We've heard several testimonies that that is not the safest way to go forward because, of course, the people who are enmeshed in the work are the best people to do the redactions. And I'm just wondering if you've ever seen that happen within the system that you're working in.
I think I can answer generally about confidential information. What I can't answer about is particularly security classified information, except to say that, yes, some of our committees get it, they handle it safely. But there is always a problem, and I'll be brutal about this, about sharing information with a committee, any one of whom's members can stand on the floor of the House of Commons and reveal secret information without any without any comeback. And that is the consequence of Article 9 of the Bill of Rights. It's very important. That isn't a barrier to information sharing where there's trust, but it does mean that trust is very important. And that does explain why the ISC, which is the committee which does get most high-level information, is so constrained, and there is such a strong statutory constraint about what it can have. And I should say, by the way, that the ISC is not headquartered in the House. It's headquartered over within government buildings, which helps keep matters secure. Turning away from classified information, but to information which committees have received, I mentioned that there had been orders passed for the government to put papers into the hands of committees. And those committees have agreed protocols, and indeed the Committee of Privileges, which I was very close to on another matter, agreed a very similar protocol for the handling of those papers. They were to be kept secure. They were to be accessed by members only in invigilated conditions. No electronic devices were allowed. Notes could be made on the papers. Each member had their own set of papers, but they couldn't be kept, but they couldn't be taken away from the room. There would be a record of who had accessed the papers. And while the two committees in question reserved the right to publish the papers, they said that they would consult the government, before they did it. So that is how we would do it. It also required having a very strong, upgrading the House of Commons safes. So it can be done, although I should stress that these were not top secret papers. They were papers which the government considered commercially sensitive and where there were criminal investigations going on. The committee respected those terms. Turning to I'm not sure I have very much else to add to that, thinking about it.
Sorry, interpreters. Well, thank you for that, and I only have a few seconds. So my last quick question is, I know that here, of course, when an MP is elected, they get training on different aspects of being a parliamentarian. So I'm just wondering, is there any expansion of training through the House on how to identify if foreign interference may be impacting you?
We are doing a great deal more on security briefing than we used to. I'm not familiar with the details of that briefing, but one of our problems, we're very worried about the physical threat to members before you get on to foreign interference. So I'm sure we'll start by focusing on that.
Thank you. So the clock is just under 5 minutes, and I am going to ask if suitable, and if not suitable, you don't have to say anything, just show me your displeasure in what I'm saying. Mr. Nader just has 2 minutes of questions. We could then go for a vote and get 2 minutes to Mrs. Romanado and a quick question before noon, if that's okay. And if anything happens, because if somebody has to go vote, you're welcome to go. If something was to happen, I will commit to suspending the meeting right away because, perfect. Mr. Nader, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Sampson, for joining us today. And I might offer our congratulations as well. I understand you've been named a Commander of the British Empire in the King's Honours List, birthday honours list. So, congratulations on behalf of your counterparts here in Canada. I wanted to follow up on Ms. Blaney's comments about kind of some of the processes for the production of papers. Like the UK, our committees have that. Authority to command papers as part of the grand inquest of the nation. But I wanted to follow up you talked about some of the procedures that could be in place. And I was curious, in a situation where a commitment was made around a committee table that the government would be allowed to redact certain documents, withhold certain information, whether there would be a parliamentary double check, so to speak. For example, in Canada, we have a law clerk. I believe the counterpart would be the Speaker's Council. Whether there'd be opportunity for the Speaker's Council, or in our case, the law clerk, to verify information that might be redacted, that might be withheld, along certain parameters that the committee or that the House might set.
This has come up in my experience about matters which aren't secret, so I'm not sure how helpful my answer will be. I think the committee itself will take a judgment. If it is the names of junior civil servants, it will not mind. If it is if they think there might be something more contentious, they will press for it. So, for example, the Committee of Privileges has recently done an inquiry into the conduct of the former Prime Minister and asked for the notes of an inquiry into parties, or the interview notes. They were provided at first in a redacted form, and the committee spent several months pressing until the government produced them unredacted. So I think the answer is the committee will look and take a sense check of the sort of things that have been redacted. But for example, the House will delegate certain things to officials. So, for example, if there are police searches on the parliamentary estate, which switches it round, and there is an issue about whether the police wish to look at privileged papers, the Clerk of the Journals and Speaker's Council together have helped the police assess the material and say, no, that's privileged. Yes, that's, as it might be a personal paper, you can have that. So there is some analogy for clerkly or law clerk involvement.
Thank you. And what I'm just going to do as we are approaching the vote, but the walk has to take place, is I'm going to go Mrs. Romanado 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witness for being here with us. I want to pick up on something you said earlier, that when there were actions regarding sanctions, that the action taken was state level rather than a contempt. And then when you did have to deal with the question of intimidating an MP, could you walk us through quickly how would we be able to determine if a member's privilege was breached if they were not aware of the intimidation tactics? Because that's what we're discussing today, is we're trying to determine whether or not MP Chong's privilege was breached based on intimidation through a foreign state actor, but MP Chong has testified he was not aware of it. So we're trying to determine whether or not there was a breach of privilege. If you have any expert advice in this regard, it would be most welcome.
There was a similar case, or an analogous case, where the Sussex police took action against a member for what he'd said in the House. They issued with a protection with a notice designed to stop harassment, and that was held to be a contempt. The member knew it was in decline. It was designed to stop him doing it again. But at the same time, the police had recorded, I think, a complaint about the member's alleged racism, and they'd done it privately. And that was held not to be a contempt because the member didn't know, so he couldn't have been intimidated or impeded. I can send your clerk the link to the report.
That would be most welcome, actually, because that's kind of what we're dealing with, whether or not someone's privilege was breached if they were not aware. Thank you.
I think the word's there. If you look at what a contempt is, it's not just something which does impede a member. It's something which has a tendency. And I think you might want to reflect on whether, knowing that it might have happened, obviously you can think about anything. You can scare yourself, there's a tiger in the canopy of your double bed. But if you know that something is likely to have happened, then you might be getting onto the tendency angle.
Thank you so much.
Mrs. Sampson, thank you so much for your time. We are just going to pause to vote, so the vote is live for anyone using the app. And if it's suitable, do you mind sticking around for about 15 minutes?
This is very familiar to me.
Okay, perfect. Because then what we will do is Madame Goudreau and Mrs. Blaney will just get in a quick question, and then we'll do the switch over. And I will just note that we know that you are the expert when it comes to privilege in the House, but I think we're trying to figure out kind of where there's abilities and how you operate. So we do appreciate you broadening the scope of your expertise and just where members are coming from. So we'll be right back. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for waiting. Meeting suspended. just finish off with this panel with a quick question to Madame Goudreau, followed by Mrs. Blaney. Madame Goudreau.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is a very simple one. It's my last question. I would like to give you the opportunity to make suggestions to us that we here could use to bring about change. You have mentioned that for all practical purposes, you've looked at how we operate here in our committee in Parliament. How can we improve what we do?
Is this about foreign interference or about the? I don't know how I do not know whether the Canadian Parliament has a security department or how that operates. We have over the years have great increases in the capability and professionalism of our security department. It was always helpful. And I think that having that informal is the wrong word. Having a very capable security department is the key to it. But as a procedural and privilege expert, I'm not sure I can tell you too much about it, except that has vastly increased my peace of mind.
Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney.
And quickly, just the last question that I have for you today, and again, thank you so much for being here, is you talked about your security department. Here, of course, we have similarly the Sergeant at Arms. And one of the changes that we've made around foreign interference, or that is in the process of changing, I should say, is more connection with the Sergeant at Arms, who will connect with members of Parliament and let them know if they're being targeted for anything specific around foreign interference. And I'm just wondering if you guys have a similar process and how that is effective, or if there's any concerns. Thank you.
Before giving evidence, I discussed with Alison Giles about her remit, my remit, and what should be said in public. So I think if I may, I'll suggest that when you see Alison, you ask her.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. With that, we really want to thank you for your time and attention today, Ms. Sampson. And I know you will be sending some information to our clerk. We will have that translated in both official languages and circulated around. Should anything else come to mind, please do not hesitate to reach out. But once again, on behalf of PROC committee members, thank you for your time and attention today, and we wish you a good rest of the day. With that, committee member. With that, committee members, we will just suspend for a quick 30 seconds to do the switch over for our next panel. So meeting suspended. Please don't go. We are going to call the meeting back to order. In our next panel, we have Mr. Ward Elcock, former director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And from the Bureau, we have Samuel Cooper, investigative journalist. You will each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement. And Mr. Cooper, we'll start with you. Welcome to Proc.
Thank you. It's an honor to be called to testify. My name is Sam Cooper, and I am now reporting for my own journalism platform, The Bureau. The Bureau's first two stories are relevant to your examination today of information I have reviewed in documents regarding Beijing's, quote, threatening Canada's elected officials to deter criticism, end quote. First, I wish to inform the committee of how I collected knowledge on these matters in the past decade. While covering foreign investment in Vancouver real estate, I started researching foreign interference in connection to the public statements of former CSIS Director Richard Fadden in 2010. In September 2014, for the Province newspaper, I authored a story titled, Is China Influencing BC's Municipal Politicians? The story, using access to information, examined CSIS documents. In March 2015, for the Province, I authored another story titled, Chinese police run secret operations in BC to hunt allegedly corrupt officials and laundered money. I believe these stories provide historical context for this committee. Now to the 2021 federal election. I'll quote from Now Public Information in my June 17th article for the Bureau, an extended interview with MP Erin O'Toole. In the published interview, I told Mr. O'Toole, quote, I have reported about this January 2022 Privy Council Office intelligence report sourced from 100 CSIS reports. What the document said is that a small number of MPs in the 2021 election reported concern for their families, their privacy, their reputations, and their re-election chances as a result of targeted CCP activity. Mr. O'Toole answered, quote, that's very troubling to hear. I'm not surprised because when I was briefed on the examples of intelligence that were shared with me, some of the activities were so intense in the Greater Toronto Area and the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, it would not surprise me if people were followed, tabs kept on people, intimidation, voter suppression. I questioned Mr. O'Toole again, saying, quote, I learned from sources aware of CSIS investigations in 2021 that CSIS officers found that Chinese officials in Toronto were following one MP during the campaign. They were also allegedly approaching voters in relation to this candidate, and CSIS found this activity, I was told, coordinated and alarming. Mr. O'Toole answered, well, that seems to coordinate or correspond completely with the fourth element that I included in my speech in the House of Commons, which is one clear example of voter suppression in a riding in Canada. Finally, I'll quote from the preamble from my interview with Mr. O'Toole in my article. In it, I explained that I personally received a CSIS threat brief in 2021 after my book on Chinese foreign interference in Canada was published. I wrote in my June 17th article for the Bureau, quote, a CSIS officer met me in Ottawa. I was told that Chinese security agents in Canada are dangerous, and they were tasked to look into my background, study the impact of my book, and to discover my reporting sources, end quote. I believe this information provides important context for the committee that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to influence or intimidate journalists in the same way it seeks to influence or threaten Canadian politicians. Thanks. I look forward to your questions. And I'm sure the honorable members understand I take the protection of my sources very seriously, so please understand I cannot answer questions about identifying confidential sources or speak about editorial or legal processes regarding my prior reporting. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Alcock, welcome to PROC. The floor is yours.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for the introduction. I don't have any prepared remarks, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions that any members may have, although obviously I'm still subject to the security of information legislation, so there are limits to what I can say, obviously, even from my memories.
And thank you for those comments. We will enter into 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I will direct my questions to Mr. Cooper. You reported that, of no relation, you reported that Beijing's Toronto consulate directed clandestine funding through proxies in the 2019 election. Can you elaborate on how this scheme worked?
Again, I'm going to have to be very within the lines of the reporting that I did and not speak to the collection of sourcing, whether it be from persons with awareness of investigations or persons with awareness of the January 2022 Privy Council Office Special Report, sourced from 100 CSIS reports. I have commented that this document is sourced from investigations started in the Toronto area in January 2019, according to my understanding. And the document very clearly states that, from my recollection, the Toronto consulate directed clandestine funding into an election interference network. And as the members know, the stories had great impact. We're here today because of that story. And I do need to not speak very freely about the sourcing or the methods that I understand. I need to stick to simply the stories speak for themselves.
And I recognize that, but the Prime Minister, in response to your reporting, has repeatedly claimed that he never was briefed about, quote, candidates receiving money from China. Now, it's my observation that that statement is very, very carefully crafted and deliberate, because it seems to me to be unlikely that Beijing would simply transfer funds directly to a candidate, that the scheme would be significantly more elaborate than that. So based upon the intelligence that you reviewed, did Beijing indirectly fund candidates in the 2019 election through this clandestine network?
I'll, before answering your question, refer back to, I know the members paid close attention to the speech of MP Aaron O'Toole, and on his CSIS threat briefing, he spoke of, from my recollection, concrete funding of a misinformation product through the United Front Work Department directed from Beijing, so that funds are paid in Canada, my understanding of his speech, which funds a misinformation product, essentially from my understanding of his speech, to attack Mr. O'Toole's reputation. So I think it's fair to say that conversely, I've explained in a number of interviews about my reporting, Beijing uses carrots and sticks. So if we are talking about the concrete funding of a misinformation product, a stick, to attack a member of parliament, it is very reasonable, and according to sources with awareness of the investigations, to understand that the consulate is also directing funds into an election interference network comprised of many different types of individuals comprised of what I understand and have read in a Privy Council Office intelligence assessment, media entities that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So with regards to your question, did Beijing fund candidates? It's my understanding they funded a network which is directed to support Beijing's preferred candidates. And as Member O'Toole told me in my interview for the first story, he wasn't going to speak to the exact methods of transfer. I don't know that CSIS has visibility on exchanges, physical exchanges, wire transfers. Perhaps, Mr. Elcock, technology has advanced, but I can tell you that CSIS has and studies FinTrack records, and that can, I believe and I understand that FinTrack records will provide revelations on direct methods of transfer and where money went.
Now, Mr. O'Toole did cite essentially four ways in which Beijing interfered in the 2021 election based upon your review of intelligence relating to the 2019 election. Is it accurate to say that they employed the same methods or similar methods?
I believe it's accurate to say that the United Front Work Department has very large, very sophisticated networks of community proxies. I just reported in my first story for the Bureau several days ago that, citing the NSICOP 2019 Foreign Interference Review, the Consul General in Vancouver, round about 2015, boasted of controlling over 100 community groups. I have done a number of reports pointing towards the control of community groups and community leader proxies to support certain candidates, and this support can come through, according to the documents I've read, funds and media support, logistical support.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Elcock, I've been paying particular attention to some of the interviews that you've been doing in the media over the course of the past few months. And there's been many times where I've thought the remarks that you've made have been quite insightful on the matters of foreign interference. One thing in particular that you've said multiple times is that you felt that these intelligence leaks over multiple months have been kind of a slow drip and that they were likely politically motivated. Can you explain why you would say that?
I think one of the alternatives, in terms of trying to determine who the leaker is, one of the alternatives is that there is a political motivation. I don't have I can't be certain about that because I obviously don't know who the leaker is, and at this point, so far as we know, nobody knows who the leaker is. But certainly that would be a possible motivation. It is striking the way in which has been striking throughout the process, however, how the information flow was managed. I assume it was not dripped out to the news media or to various reporters that had the information, but that it flowed over a shorter period of time, and but it has been very carefully dripped out to keep the story going as much as anything, perhaps. But the idea of political motivation is hard to avoid.
Thank you. And Mr. Cooper, to you now. On March 22nd, you published an article with the headline, Liberal MP Han Dong secretly advised Chinese diplomat in 2021 to delay freeing the two Michaels. Do you stand by this headline?
I don't write the headlines, but I stand by the story. I know that Global News stands by the story, and there is a legal procedure underway. And the story speaks for itself, and the statement of defense speaks for itself. The story stands.
Thank you. So despite the fact that the article used the term allegedly at least about 10 times, you chose to frame the headline, or the newspaper chose to frame the headline excluding that language in the headline. Was that done on purpose?
I said at the outset I won't speak to editorial processes or legal procedures, but I can assure the honourable member that legal vetting and editorial vetting of these stories is extremely rigorous.
Thank you.
That's
And
all I'll say.
why
about
didn't
that
you
matter.
include allegedly in the headline, Mr. Cooper?
Sorry?
Why did you not include allegedly in the headline?
This is a matter for editorial procedures and legal vetting procedures.
Okay. Did you review the transcript from the supposed conversation between MP Dong and the Consular General?
I told the honorable member at the outset that I'm not going to speak to editorial processes, identification of sources, or legal procedures around this story, and I'll repeat it again and again.
Thank you. And will you table the supposed transcript that we've learned from the Right Honorable David Johnson's report does exist? If you have or haven't reviewed that, I understand you won't talk about it. Will you table that with this committee, the transcript, please?
I didn't prepare any materials around that question, and I'll stand, as I told the honorable member, I'm not going to speak to
You can send it in later,
materials.
Mr. Cooper, if you'd like. We'd be happy if you would table it with the committee. Will you table it with the committee?
Going back to my introduction, I'm not going to speak to editorial processes or legal processes around
So
prior
Global News
stories.
has, that report has actually put in a statement that Global News has not confirmed the allegations in the story. And the Globe and Mail refused to run a story, similar story, because they couldn't verify the claim that was made in that story. So what I'm interested to know is, based on the fact that these were allegations, in the statement of defense, Global News also says that these were allegations and not meant to be taken as fact. How could you, with any degree of journalistic integrity, publish an article that is sheerly just based on unfounded allegations?
The article is based on going back to my opening statement for the honorable member, and I'll reiterate it again and again. The story stands. I will not speak to identification of sources. I will not speak to editorial processes, and I want the member to remember, I will not
Mr. Cooper.
speak to legal processes surrounding this story.
Thank you for that. Mr. Cooper, the Canadian Association of Journalists has ethics guidelines that state, we journalists seek documentation to support the reliability of these sources and their stories, and are careful to distinguish between assertions and fact. The onus is on us to verify all information. Do you agree that that is the ethics guideline that you should be following as a journalist?
The story stands, and we're here today because of a body of reporting, and I'll remind the member that I said I'm not going to speak to editorial processes
So is that
or
a no
legal
then?
processes.
You don't
No,
believe
it's
that
not
you
a
should
no.
follow the ethics guideline for your own profession?
The answer, honorable member, is the story stands and the body of work stands.
Okay, so
And
we
we are
know
here
that the
today
headline
because of
was
the body of work.
demonstrably false, sir.
I'm just going to pause and just remind us that one person speaks at a time. Mr. Cooper, I know that you're not a stranger to how committees operate, so there is sometimes repetition around here, and I think it sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. So members do have the time, and if we can just have an exchange back and forth, because the work that we're doing is important work. But I will just a reminder, one person speaks at a time because it helps with the record and translation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, the Right Honourable David Johnson, the Director of CSIS, deputy ministers and ministers all confirm that the headline that you published as a part of that story was demonstrably false. So did you knowingly mislead Canadians?
The story stands. The editorial procedures and the legal procedures around that story are subject of a legal procedure, as you know. And at the outset, I told the honorable member, the story stands, and I will not speak to editorial processes or legal procedures regarding my prior story.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau, 6 minutes.
6 minutes, Madame Goudreau. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I'd like to dig a little deeper about motives, about grounds. How can it be So my questions will approach the matter from the perspective of what would have been the motivation to have an article like that in November 2022. I'd like to hear you on that.
If I understand the question, it's about what is the editorial or vetting process or the motivation of a journalist to report on. Could you rephrase, please?
Of the subject matter. What was the motivation in your work, the grounds in your work that led you to be concerned with this particular subject?
As I said in my opening statement, after hearing and researching and filing access to information requests regarding former CSIS Director Richard Fadden's very public statement, I was working in Vancouver in a major newspaper, and I was seeing and hearing of activities related to financial crime that started to appear possibly to feed into foreign interference type activities. So the motivation for me started about over 10 years ago to understand essentially public interest questions that were very current, these were matters that people in Vancouver wanted to know about. I completed a body of reporting in Vancouver. I then landed in Ottawa, as it were, and my motivation at that time was I understood this is the seat of power in Canada, and that decisions taken around foreign investment, matters of laws that CSIS or the RCMP is regulated by, and whether foreign actors can be prosecuted or can freely operate. This was my motivation, and as I've explained, I do a number of podcast interviews about some of my stories, and especially my book. My book, which was called Willful Blindness, delved into the connectivity that I know that you've heard from Commissioner Duhaime recently. He was recently on a 60 Minutes Australia and said that that is the RCMP, was seeing connectivity between organized crime and directly up to the Chinese state. This was the subject matter of my book, and so by making findings in my book, this led to more information, if you will, in Ottawa coming to me. And when I found this new information and how laws have not been changed to so that the government of Canada can really find connections to foreign agents that are easily found now in the United States, as we see in so-called 110 police station prosecutions. As my first story said, it quoted a CSIS officer saying, at this point, it's just CSIS telling politicians, hey, be careful out there. There are no laws and regulations that allow really a firm deterrent or prosecution or investigation even.
Je sais, Madame la Présidente.
I know, Madam Chair, this is a rather delicate question, but I'm quite convinced that Mr. Cooper could answer it. When your sources confirm or deny information, what leads them to disclose? So there must be something deep within them that leads them to come to speak to you. So what can motivate these sources? What makes them come to you to talk about your subject?
It's a very simple answer. Again, my book, Willful Blindness, really grew out of disclosures from a casino anti-money laundering official named Ross Alderson. He was very concerned about the activity he saw, and his view was that there was willful blindness with British Columbia's government with regards to the lack of prosecution against transnational crime and money laundering. I understand that people in Ottawa, people in other jurisdictions, including the United States, I've said that people in the Pentagon were interested in my book. So there are officials at a high level that understand what's happening in Canada, and there are whistleblowers that don't believe that the adequate laws are in place to investigate and prosecute foreign interference. This can be the type of motivation for sources, simply national security and
Malheureusement, il me
patriotism.
reste peu de
I don't have very much time left, unfortunately, but I do have a question for Mr. Alcock. You were in place from 94 to 2004. What were the directives or the ministerial guidelines that existed at that time with respect to threats or with respect to interference?
Madam Chair, in response to the honourable member's question, it's a bit of a challenge to make a short answer. The issue of foreign interference is really just espionage. It is a subset of espionage involving sometimes not necessarily intelligence services, but foreign actors. We treated it then, as it is largely treated now, as espionage, attracting counter-espionage programs on the part of the service, I'm sure even today, and back then as well. Were there specific directions to provide information to people? No. The reality is CSIS was established to provide information to the government itself, and was in fact specifically enjoined from providing it beyond the government. So giving threat briefings to people was very complicated then, still is relatively complicated now, although there are some new directions that allow perhaps more flow of information.
à mon deuxième tour.
I would like to have a question on second round. Thank you, sir. Thank you to you.
I'm going to go with the same approach as earlier, unless we come to a different conclusion, and just keep us moving in this meeting. Mrs. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and of course I thank the witnesses for being here. I'm going to start by asking a question or two for Mr. Alcock. Thank you again for being here. We've heard a lot of testimony over the last several months, and we also have heard very clearly from Canadians that they're worried about what's happening in terms of foreign interference and what that means for our democracy. And of course, my major concern is that if Canadians lose faith in their institutions, it becomes very hard to do the things that we need to do in a safe way. So I guess my question to you is we've heard a lot of testimony from ministers about not knowing that certain MPs were being targeted, that information was provided, but they didn't receive it in a timely fashion. It just seems to not make any sense. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts with your time serving in that role about communication processes, and if there was any concerns that you had at that time about making sure that people had the right information to make decisions that they needed to make in those levels.
Madam Chair, in response to the honourable member's question, it's rarely hard for intelligence services, once they get beyond the idea that you're collecting secret intelligence and you've decided that you have to share it. Most intelligence agencies want to share intelligence information with higher levels of government. I think the problem in this country is that pretty much across all phases of our, whether it's Parliament, whether it's government, whether it's the bureaucracy or whatever, we're not a country that has much concern about national security. Most Canadians have very little concern about national security and little interest over the years, and it's not surprising then that sometimes the flow of information to beyond the intelligence agency is not as good as it should be if people have no interest. Unless we build a culture of more of a culture of national security, we don't necessarily have to rise to the level of our neighbor to the south, which is a little more obsessed with the subject. But unless we do develop a broader understanding of national security issues, care more about it, both Canadians and government at all levels, then the reality is the flow of information will not happen because nobody's really interested.
Well, thank you for that. And we know that if, according to the current legislation, the CSIS legislation, it says very clearly that if an MP is targeted, it's really up to the minister to decide what information is given to members of parliament. Of course, we know that there's been a change in that process through a ministerial directive. But I'm still concerned about that. So I'm just wondering, in your thought, is it time for us to review that section of legislation? And is there a better process to review it on a more regulated format?
Madam Chair, I think that one can overcomplicate the issue of providing flow of information. There are challenges to providing information to anybody beyond the service, because what you're talking about is counter-espionage operations, which are very sensitive and very difficult. So the disclosure of information that discloses the existence of investigations is complicated. The flow of information to members of Parliament really ought to be couched around a level of risk. If there is a real level of risk. If there is a real level of risk, then information should flow in some way. For example, there was not a member of Parliament, or not a minister, but there was the murder recently in British Columbia, and there was a report in the paper that there was a threat briefing for that individual from CSIS. There were obviously death threats in respect of that individual. That's very serious. And at that point, you clearly want to try and make sure information flows. Whether all information about all levels of foreign interference need to flow, that's a big question. And I doubt very much whether it's in the interests of counter-espionage operations for all of that information to flow in order to protect those operations.
Well, another discussion that we've had here is around education and having more broad education for Canadians on the whole, so that there's better understanding of what foreign interference could look like, and at least that critical thought. So you talked about building a culture of concern. Do you think that education of members of Parliament, government, and also all levels of government, and also just everyday Canadians is a key part of that process?
I'm not sure that, I think the hope, Madam Chair, is that on the part of many people in the community, intelligence and national security community, was that talking about issues more about national security would cause people to care more about them. I suspect that probably doesn't really happen. I suspect it requires something more like the current discussion, although I don't like the way in which it has happened. And it's entirely inappropriate, but it clearly has stimulated some discussion. Unfortunately, I think some of it has been overly mired in politics, and partisan politics in particular.
Well, thank you for that. And so when you talk about a culture of concern, then how do we create that? What's your opinion on that?
I think Madam Chair, I think that the way to create that is ultimately for Canadians to have an interest in national security issues and to pay attention to those issues, and to demand that their elected representatives also pay attention to those issues. Mm-hmm. In my view, elected officials are wise people. If they know that the average Canadian doesn't care about national security, I suspect there are not many elected officials who are going to spend a lot of time on national security issues. Mm-hmm. If Canadians demand that people pay attention to those issues, then there will inevitably be more discussion of them, and we will perhaps arrive at a place that most of our allies arrived at years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to the second round with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sahota. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cooper, in your June 15th article in the Bureau, you indicate that in the NSCOP report from 2019 on foreign interference, that report states that, quote, there were important gaps in the documents, close quote, disclosed by the PCO to NSCOP. Are you able to elaborate upon that in any way?
read the document, and that story that you cite included a number of quotations, and I would say my very rigorous analysis of the document and the findings. The panel examined 620 intelligence documents representing over 4,000 pages of material, and they noted that CSIS was very forthcoming in disclosures. The RCMP was forthcoming. Public Safety Canada contributed little, is the wording, and the quotation that I wrote in that story was that there were important gaps in Privy Council office documents. So that was a terse statement, and there was no context beyond that statement. I can make an educated assessment that, as the honourable members know, the Privy Council office is there to give counsel on national security matters to the cabinet. And if there were important documents missing, it would lead me to speculate that perhaps there were records that would have provided more clarity on what was known about key risks. And I can't give the member any more information than that.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that. You noted in your interview with Aaron O'Toole that you'll be reporting more on the Beijing police activities in Canada. You said, quote, "We now have reports of Beijing officials coming into Canada under false cover and acting within these so-called police networks. It's not just about buildings, it's about networks and community meetings," closed quote. So can you elaborate upon that?
Yes, I will be reporting on those matters further, but I think it's fair to share my generalized knowledge today about why my public interest standards are so focused on the issue. I understand from many years of source disclosure and knowledge that including my own ventures into Hong Kong Canadian and Chinese Canadian diaspora communities, Uyghur Canadian communities, that there is an unacceptable level of fear within some of these communities that foreign officials, suspected foreign officials, are coming into Canada. I reported on a case, again, citing my book, China's Most Wanted, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, was a man named Lai Cheng-sing. There are enough court documents that the members can search his case. I think this context is important. He came to Canada and was engaged in underground casino, money laundering, criminal activities. He was also, the evidence showed, quite connected to the various sectors of the Chinese security and intelligence apparatus, and yet he got on the wrong side of some people in Beijing, and they pursued him with police agents from the Ministry of Public Security and a special unit who came into Canada under false sort of business visas. And I understand that this activity has accelerated since 2015 in Canada. The police stations we now know of because of Safeguard Defenders, but it's about community networks with, my sources say, feared people acting both with officials from China to question people, to intimidate people in the community. And again, it's not about 6 or 7 known buildings in Canada, as the Safeguard Defenders say. This is about networks and the flow of communications between the Ministry of Public Security and, as we see in the indictments in the United States, proxies that live, work, and do business in communities. And that's what I am concerned about in cities, including Toronto and Vancouver.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To Mr. Cooper, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to perhaps, and maybe I can clarify the question again regarding whether before writing your first article, you had reviewed some sort of transcript or listened to a tape. I know that you said you won't reveal You won't be speaking to legal proceedings or editorial decisions, and of course, we don't want you to reveal sources. But I believe that it's a question that you should be able to answer as to whether you reviewed or read a transcript before coming up with the story on Hondong.
Which story are you referring to, sir?
I'm referring particularly to the allegations regarding the member from Don Valley North.
Yeah, with apologies to the honourable member, I can say that I have reviewed documents, I have spoken with sources with knowledge of the high-profile and sensitive investigations started in 2019, but I can't speak further to the nature of editorial and legal procedures surrounding that particular story.
Was that document a transcript?
I'm not going to answer that because as I've said, I won't speak to editorial or legal procedures in detail surrounding stories, but the story speaks for itself, and we're referring to a story that is subject of legal activity, and the filed statement of defense speaks to all the information that you will get on that.
Well, Global News' legal statement says that they were in particular allegations and not factual findings. Would you agree with this, Mr. Cooper?
The story regards information from sources who make allegations. It's very clear that there has been no prosecutions or findings of fact regarding that story or any of the matters we're here speaking about. If the member would let me finish. We are here today in a very generalized way because we don't have a foreign interference registry. We have recommendations in NSI COP 2019 please let me finish, that this government
study. I'm going to actually just pause.
Thank you, Mr.
Cooper. Once again, I know that everyone has their purposes. You're always welcome, Mr. Cooper, to provide us information. We will have it translated in both official languages, but I do need the exchange from member to witness to flow back and forth with not overlap. Because at the end of the day, it is members' time. I will always ensure that witnesses have some time to answer, but usually just matching the length of time consumed on either end. Back to Mrs. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're definitely here today because of a story that you published, and that's what brings us here. So I really wanted to make it more clear. Do you think you possibly could have gotten it wrong?
No, the story stands, and the legal.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the Governor General stated unequivocally that the member from Don Valley North had not discussed extending the legal detention of Michael Koberg and Michael Spavor with Chinese government officials, and I quote that it was said, "I have reviewed the same intelligence report that was provided to the Prime Minister relating to the allegations," and this is in regards to MP Dong, "which I am advised is the only intelligence that speaks to this issue. I can report the following. The allegation is false. Mr. Dong discussed the two Michaels with a PRC official, but did not suggest to the official that the PRC extend their detention." This report has caused Mr. Dong, a member of parliament, in addition to that, his family and many others, a lot of harm, and perhaps irreparable harm. Do you have any comments to that?
My only comment is the stories starting in November 2022 meet the highest standards of public interest, and public interest reporting, referring back to my last attempted answer, NSI COP 2019 asked this government to look at the Security of Information Act, the CSIS Act, and to look into the measures taken in Australia in 2018.
We'll be heading down that direction, so I appreciate that. I also understand you mentioned you work for the Bureau right now. I wanted to know that you've talked many times about transparency, and upon Googling, you can't really find out what the source to the Bureau is. So who funds the Bureau?
I think I'll have more to say about that now, but I can assure the member it's not a foreign government or anyone outside of Canada.
But why can you not let us know then that where the funding comes from?
I didn't come here prepared today to disclose what a public interest investigative reporter who's looking into important matters, who may or may not be, interested in my reporting.
I think, though, as a journalist, that you would be interested in knowing who you work for. You can find out easily the Globe, the National Post, where their funding comes from. Why not the Bureau?
The Bureau is a subscription-driven platform on Substack. As the honourable members know, that Canadian media is changing, and authors, writers such as Terry Glavin are on Substack now. This is about subscribers.
Thank you. We're going to go 2.5 minutes to Madame Goudreau, followed by Mrs. Blaney. Madame Goudreau.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a question for each of you. The first is for Mr. Alcock. If you had the opportunity to have a conversation with the Prime Minister, with all the expertise that you have witnessed in terms of progression of issues, and it's been some months now that we've been trying to shed light on this matter, what would be your ultimate piece of advice for the Prime Minister to say what should be done? Because we're at that point.
Madam Chair, I have given advice to Prime Ministers in the past. I'm not sure that in this case I would know enough to give advice to this particular Prime Minister. I do think the government probably could have acted faster on issues of foreign interference, which is a serious issue, although sometimes I disagree with what people see as serious and not so serious foreign interference. Having said that, the reality of much of the reporting, I think, is I think that there's some question about whether all the reporting that we in the public and in Parliament have seen is in fact accurate. And I think that comes both from the testimony of people before this and other committees, but also the report of Mr. Johnston. If the facts on which we are all operating out here in the public are not accurate, then it's pretty hard to give the Prime Minister advice.
Yes, I don't have much time, Chair, but what I understand is that we now have to act now. We have evolved. Everything has been increased, warnings have been issued, and the moment to act is now. We have to shed light on this type of issue to demystify it. That's what you should perhaps say to the Prime Minister. Let's go.
In a sense, Madam Chair, I agree with the member's point that the Prime Minister, and I said it a second ago, that probably the government should have acted on foreign interference perhaps earlier than it has, and more determinedly than it has. Having said that, foreign interference is a very large problem, and most of the discussion, frankly, that I've seen is on a relatively narrow part of foreign interference in this country. There is a lot more to do with foreign interference than so far that I have seen in any discussions, public discussions. So action sounds simple, but it's not necessarily easy. For example, a registry makes a great deal of sense, but there is also a lot of view out there, I think, that a registry will solve a lot more problems than it really will. A lot of the problems of foreign interference will not be solved by a registry.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney?
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I'm going to come back to Mr. Alcock. So you just answered my previous colleague's question, and you said that it needs to be broader, and the conversation that you're seeing so far in the public sphere is more narrow, and that the foreign agent registry is not the only thing that needs to happen. So what do you think it needs to be in terms of broadening? What are the areas that we should be focusing on, and where do you feel that we're being too narrow in our discussions?
Madam Chair, I think, while I may not agree with everything, all of Mr. Cooper's reports, news reports are, after all, news stories, not fact necessarily. The reality is that the things that we need to do are broader than simply registries. We need more counterintelligence work because you need to identify all of the activities, which means more funding probably for CSIS. We need to be looking at issues, for example, why is it that the Chinese media, Chinese language media in this country largely follows Beijing's line on Ukraine and a variety of other issues? We would not tolerate that with RT in the case of Russia or Russian reporting. Why is it that Chinese language reporting in Canada often follows Beijing's line? Is it controlled by Beijing? Do we know? There are a wide variety of issues on foreign interference that need to be engaged on, not just some of the issues that frankly have been discussed in committee hearings as a result of a number of leaks.
Well, thank you. And I think that brings us back to a really important point, which is diaspora communities have been coming forward for a very long time, talking about concerns that they have and not feeling that they are really getting the response that they require. So when you discuss this, do you think having better connections with those communities and really amplifying those voices is an important part of us addressing the issues of foreign interference?
Madam Chair, it certainly is important to have close connections to diaspora communities. It is sometimes rather more difficult than the honourable member might suggest or might appear to suggest, in the sense that many parts of the community are unwilling to come forward and unwilling to have discussions, and some parts of the community actually share the views of the foreign country. So this is not an issue that is going to be easily resolved overnight.
Thank you. We are at 3 minutes of bells left. Do we need another round, or do you want one more round? Yeah. So what we're going to ask Mr. Cooper and Mr. Alcock is that we have our vote, and then we'll have up to 10 minutes for members to return to this room, and we'll just do one more quick, we'll finish this round. Which will be 5 minutes to the Liberals, 5 minutes to the Conservatives, 5 minutes to the Liberals, and then we'll get into our committee business. Okay? Thank you. So meeting suspended. Please stay tuned. like to thank Mr. Cooper and Mr. Elcock for waiting for us for the vote to take place. The floor, 5 minutes à Mr. Berthold, suivi.
5 minutes for Mr. Berthold, followed by Madame Romanado. Mr. Berthold, welcome to our guests, Mr. Cooper, Mr. Elcock, for being here. We note that the Liberals that have been the party in power for some 8 years now have been very quick to denounce your article, Mr. Cooper, and discredit it. But there were problems that you revealed in your article. And yet, on May the 3rd, 2018, the Prime Minister himself at World Press Freedom Day said that he said that he saluted journalistic freedom and he was very much against illegal arrests in some parts of the world that was intended to silence journalists. But now, Mr. Cooper, since your article, other journalists have followed up, have written articles, and the existence of what you confirmed has indeed been proven to be true. The Chinese police stations here, we learned Michael Chong, Aaron O'Toole, Jimmy Kwan also have been intimidated by Peking, and also members were informed about this by CSIS. Aaron O'Toole has confirmed it as well in terms of the interference in elections. But it would seem that the ministers and the Prime Minister have ignored all of this. And in fact, the relevancy of these disclosures have been even discounted by ministers. So, Mr. Cooper, I would like to hear you about Chinese interference, Beijing's interference in Canadian elections.
As I said in my opening statement, my knowledge of a Privy Council Office January 2022 special report cited that Beijing is threatening MPs who are critics of the Chinese Communist regime. So this is, I do think that MP Aaron O'Toole, in his speech in Parliament, in my view, accurately reflected that this is a growing, novel, expanding threat run through Beijing, or that is the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which seeks to egregiously control and intimidate diaspora communities. In my opening statement, I also said that because of my groundbreaking book about the Chinese Communist Party's interference networks, I myself, a journalist, received a CSIS defensive threat brief in 2021, the same time period where other MPs, we've learned, were being subject of disinformation in WeChat channels. MP Aaron O'Toole said these were funded through the United Front Work Department. So the threat to Canada, in my view, is it's not my view, it's NSICOP 2019 Review's position that Australia and Canada are being attacked in almost the exact same manner, and yet Australia in 2018, due to media reports about 2 PRC-linked donors that had funded about 7 million Australian dollars to the 3 major parties. This implicated allegedly an Australian senator. The media furor that followed, that is the public discourse that followed those media leak disclosures, led to the Australian new counter-interference laws. Similar activity in the United Kingdom after a very firm disclosure about an individual with the United Front Work Department funding parliamentarians in Britain. They have followed up with laws. Canada is facing the same or worse threat, and most concerning, our diaspora community members. Many of them have stated openly they feel they're not protected. So this is the nature of the threat against journalists, community members, politicians. most concerning to me, more than any, is that Canadians are under fear that they cannot speak openly about matters because a growing power from a foreign state is impacting lives in Canada.
And on the relevancy of having an independent inquiry, a public inquiry. We saw what happened to the independent rapporteur. It just came to a dead halt. What is your thought on an independent public inquiry?
My thoughts accord with many of the experts. I believe Mr. Elcock's colleague, Mr. Fadden, says a public inquiry should take place. A number of the witnesses you've already heard from say a public inquiry will remove the partisan bickering, the point scoring on either sides. You won't have to hear from more journalists that take the unusual step of being called to testify. There will be an independent, deep, rigorous public study of not only what happened, but what can we learn from Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, New Zealand, and other nations, by the way, that are taking this very seriously. Germany, Taiwan. We need to learn from others in a public inquiry.
Thank you. Madame Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I'll be sharing my time with MP Fergus, but I just wanted to make a statement. Mr. Cooper, you're here today based on your reports, and I was really hoping for some answers. And your unwillingness to engage on simple questions and your lack of preparedness to respond to some of the questions is disappointing. I understand you cannot discuss something that is before the courts, but I know that we have had multiple questions that are very simple in nature. So I just wanted to get that on the record that I was hoping to get some answers as I take this subject very, very seriously. With that, I'll turn the rest of my time over to MP Fergus.
Thank you, Ms. Romanado. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Elcock, I have a couple of questions for you. I've heard you say in the media, some have called the person who's responsible for leaking the information, called them whistleblowers. I've also heard you say that you don't consider them whistleblowers. Can you tell the committee why you don't consider this person or persons whistleblower?
Madam Chair, I think the simplest explanation for that, in my view, is that usually in the case of a whistleblower, there is some element of wrongdoing, disclosure of wrongdoing on the part of the government. And in this case, nobody's really alleging that there's wrongdoing. People are alleging that the government should have done more. Not quite the same thing as wrongdoing. Just because you get a security clearance doesn't mean you have the right to disclose information that's within your charge. So whoever the leaker is, they are, in point of fact, probably guilty of offenses against the not the Official Secrets Act, going too far back in my time, but it's security of information legislation. They're in violation of the legislation and should be prosecuted.
You don't have to apologize for having experience, Mr. Elcock. Indeed, in your experience, when raw intelligence is presented to you, reported to you by women or men in the field or from some of our allies, how do you treat that information? You treat that as gospel, or do you treat that as information that needs to be confirmed?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, intelligence is it's simple. I'm a lawyer by background. It's not evidence. It's information. You can give it some more credibility by collecting more information, by using other sources, by using technical methods to confirm information. But at the end of the day, intelligence is simply information you've received of whatever credibility you can attach to it. In the case of intelligence services, we probably have better means of confirming that information than, say, do the news media in terms of trying to confirm their intelligence. But in some senses, we're very similar. We're dealing with information that is until we can get some more credibility or add some more credibility, unproven.
As a result, unless that is of a spectacular or almost suppressing nature, I imagine then that information wouldn't be circulated until it had some corroboration.
Madam Chair, yes, information that has not been confirmed, unless you have received it from a credible source and it is really time-sensitive information. There may be cases where information has to be moved up, but you would have to be very clear to whoever you're providing that information that its credibility is open to question. But you're right, if there isn't something time-sensitive about it, then information before it flows up needs to be confirmed.
Thank you very much for that. So, I will just assume then, just as you mentioned, in journalism, just like intelligence gathering information, wouldn't be responsible to necessarily report on it unless there was the caveats that you added to it, without having some corroboration of that information then.
I can't speak to how, to the level of the journalists go to, although I do know most of my journalists I have known over the years that most of them do do make efforts to confirm the information before they publish it. Having said that, as I said, the reality of an intelligence service is intelligence services do have ways of gaining credibility or giving credibility to information that are not really open to journalists. So by definition, journalism is a somewhat more inexact science than even the intelligence collection agencies. Work of intelligence collection agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Alcock, Mr. Cooper. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Cooper, Mr. Alcock, thank you for your time today. Thank you for the insights you've provided. If anything else comes to mind that you would like committee members to receive, please share it with the clerk. We'll have it translated in both official languages and circulated around. With that, we're just going to suspend for 30 seconds to see our guests out, and then we will be coming back to committee business with the floor going to Mr. Cooper. Meeting suspended.
That committee business scheduled for the third hour of this meeting and the meeting scheduled for this evening be held in public. And maybe just before I cede my time, I have the reason I have put forward this motion is that the business that we will be taking up is a motion that I put on notice calling for key witnesses to be brought to this committee, the production of documents, and summer hearings. It's important that, given that this is of considerable public interest in terms of getting to the bottom of Beijing's interference, that these issues be debated openly and voted on, with members voting on the record, and we have done this consistently, and so I'm hopeful that there will be no disagreement that we continue that practice of being transparent.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I have Mr. Fergus, followed by Mrs. Blaney, and then Mrs. Sahota. Mr. Fergus.
My comment will be very brief. I think I just missed what Mr. Cooper had proposed, so I was wondering if he could, or could you explain?
He's just proposing that the committee business be taking place in public, not in camera.
I see.
So at the top of the hour, and I'll just rewind as to what I had agreed to do, was that, yeah?
Public, or are we in camera right
We're in
now?
public. We're in public.
Okay, thank you.
So so if I may, the notice that we put out was to have committee business in camera. Mr. Cooper had signaled this morning that he wanted to put his motion that had been circulated around last night on the record. And then based on the will of, and he wanted it to be in public, and then the meeting to continue in public, I had said that we would talk amongst members to see if we could achieve consensus. The approach Mr. Cooper is taking is to move the motion, and so allow it to be debatable, and then we'll vote on being in public or in camera. So that's where we're at. We are choosing whether to stay in public, or to maintain in public, as opposed to being in camera like the notice had said. Mr. Fergus?
I'd like to move in camera.
So we're debating a motion, which is to stay in public. So unless you're amending it, which would not really work. So we kind of have to deal with that before we have another one. And based on the look on your face, I see you agree with me. Is that okay?
Not quite.
Yeah, I
but,
know.
If that is what the clerk says, then.
It was what the clerk said. We have a motion on the floor. All right, I'm going to go to Mrs. Blaney and then followed by Mrs. Sahota and puis Madame Goudreau. Mrs. Blaney?
So I'm fine to move forward with this meeting in public. I'm not as comfortable to vote for this evening. I'm hoping we get everything done today in this hour. And if we can't, then my recommendation is that then we can vote if we're going to be in public or in camera at the next meeting. So I don't know if that's like a friendly, perceived as, I know it doesn't exist as a friendly amendment, but I am fine with this hour. And so if I need to move an amendment, I guess I'll hear from Mr. Cooper.
I'm fine with that, and we can take it up at the beginning of the next meeting, in which I will move a motion that we be in public at this evening. But Ms. Blaney isn't ruling that out. She's just saying that for the purpose of today, let's deal with this meeting. So,
Mr. Cooper, this is the second time you've signaled that we're having a meeting this evening, and then I thought we were trying to get it done this morning.
I don't know whether we are or we aren't. I agree with Ms. Blaney that I would prefer we not, that there would just be unanimous agreement for my very good motion.
Mrs. Blaney, do you want the floor back? Sorry.
No, I think that Mr. Cooper heard what I was laying down and he picked it up, and I think we're good to go. So I'm happy to support his motion for just this 1 hour of committee.
So maintain. So we do have resources till 1:30, so it is possible that we could get our committee business done in public, and then we'll deal with this evening accordingly, it sounds like, if we need to. Mrs. Sahota?
I should have done that. I just wanted to agree with Ms. Blaney, but also add on. I think Mr. Cooper was or had indicated a desire to read the motion out loud. I think, or maybe put it on the record verbally, right? Let's, I think, move on with that. I may change my mind eventually, depending on where the conversation goes. I think if we get into speaking about witnesses or some details of the motion, that may call for having to go in camera. There are some things I think that can be sensitive that we don't really want to talk about in a public meeting. And in all fairness, PROC has always operated that way. As for the last 7 years I've been on it, that if we are discussing witnesses, that is an in-camera matter. And so I know the motion does go into that. So let's begin. Let's see how far we go. Hopefully we can stay in public for the remainder of this meeting, like Ms. Blaney has said. And if we have to have another meeting, we'll have to discuss it then. But if it takes a turn where we're getting into the nitty-gritty of those witnesses, then maybe I may come back. And I just want to give forewarning. Thank you.
We like forewarning more than foreshadow. So I think we have agreement to maintain this meeting in public. Oh, oui. I'm coming to you. But it seems like there is agreement forming to have this meeting in public, and we're separating it from an evening meeting, should that be the case. Madame Goudreau.
Oui. Yes. I think that we've got to a turning point in our discussion. We have heard a lot of witnesses, and each time we mention the extent to which it's important to shed light on the matter, but it's also important to reassure people. So unless I'm mistaken, I think, Madam Chair, that we have not heard witnesses in camera, with the exception perhaps of our committee business or subcommittee business. But I think that out of respect for people, I can say that I am very comfortable with the very sensitive elements that we have to respect as well. But I couldn't explain why we wouldn't have a public meeting. So that's my intervention rather on this subject. I certainly appreciate that. I think that perhaps for now we can continue in public, and then we can see if we have to change, because if in fact there are certain things that the committee would like to discuss in camera, we could have that conversation at that time. But I think that we agree for the moment to stay in public now, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Cooper.
Whole motion into the record?
Yeah, I will read it into the record.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And the motion reads as follows. That in relation to its order of reference of Wednesday, May 10, 2023, concerning the intimidation campaign orchestrated by Wei Zhao against the member for Wellington Halton Hills and other members, the committee A, expand the scope of the study further to the Speaker's ruling of Wednesday, May 31, 2023, and the evidence of the acting clerk of the House on Thursday, June 8, 2023, to include the matters raised in the House by the Honourable Erin O'Toole on Tuesday, May 30, 2023. B, makes the evidence received during this study available for its study on foreign election interference. C, hold at least 8 meetings of at least 2 hours length between Tuesday, July 4th, 2023 and Friday, September 8th, 2023 on dates to be determined by the subcommittee on agenda and procedure for the purposes of hearing witnesses and considering related committee business. D, invites each of the following to appear on his or her own. 1, the Honourable Erin O'Toole for 2 hours. 2, the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Infrastructure and Communities for 2 hours. 3, the Honourable Ian Shugart, former Clerk of the Privy Council for 1 hour. 4, Janice Charette, Clerk of the Privy Council for 1 hour. 5, Rob Stewart, former Deputy Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness for 1 hour. 6, Marta Morgan, former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for 1 hour. 7, Greta Bossenmeyer, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister for 1 hour. 8, Gina Wilson, former Deputy Minister of Public Safety for 1 hour. 9, Paul McKinnon, Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet Governance, for 1 hour. 10, Zita Astravas, Chief of Staff to the President of the King's Privy Council for Canada and Minister of Emergency Preparedness, for 2 hours. 11, Jeffrey Hutchinson, former interim Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Emergency Preparedness, for 1 hour. 12, Marie-Hélène Cheyet, Executive Director of the Privy Council Office Task Force on Foreign Interference, for 2 hours. And 13, Alan Sutherland, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Machinery of Government and Democratic Institutions, for 1 hour. E invites the following to appear on panels. 1, Navigator Limited officials who had been providing support to Special Rapporteur David Johnson and to Han Dong, for 2 hours. And 2, Don Guy and Brian Topp, founding partners, GT and Company, for 2 hours. F reinvites each of the following to appear on his or her own. 1, the Honourable Melanie Joly, Minister of Foreign Affairs, for 1 hour. 2, Mike MacDonald, former Acting National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, for 1 hour. 3, Kong Pao, Ambassador to the People's Republic of China to Canada, for 2 hours. 4, Sheila Block, Counsel to Special Rapporteur David Johnson, for 2 hours. 5, Valerie Gervais, Founder and Chief Executive of Orchestra, for 1 hour. G invites each of the following to reappear on his own. 1, the Honourable Bill Blair, former Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, for an additional hour. And 2, the Right Honourable David Johnson, for an additional 2 hours following the publication of his final report. H directs that a summons do issue to Michael Chan, former Ontario Liberal Cabinet Minister, to appear on his own for 2 hours at a date and time fixed by the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure, but not later than Friday, September 8, 2023. I order the production within 3 weeks of 1, the July 2021 CSIS report entitled People's Republic of China Foreign Interference in Canada, a Critical National Security Threat, and the May 2021 CSIS Issues Management Note sent to the then Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness respecting the Beijing regime's intention to target members of this House together with all records concerning the transmission to, distribution within, analysis of, and handling by the Prime Minister's Office, the Privy Council Office, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, and the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness of this report. And 2, all other memoranda, briefing notes, emails, records of conversations, and any other relevant documents, including any drafts which are in the possession of any government department or agency, including the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, the Critical Election Incident Protocol Panel, any minister's office, and the Prime Minister's Office, containing information concerning A, planning or efforts by or on behalf of foreign governments or other foreign state actors to intimidate a member of the House of Commons, or B, the matters raised by the Honourable Erin O'Toole in the House of Commons on Tuesday, May 30th, 2023, provided that 3, these documents be deposited without redaction in both official languages with the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council. 4, a copy of the documents shall also be deposited in both official languages with the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council with any proposed redaction of information which, in the government's opinion, could reasonably be expected to compromise the identities of employees or sources or intelligence collecting methods of Canadian or allied intelligence agencies. 5, the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council shall promptly notify the committee whether the office is satisfied that the documents were produced as ordered, and if not, the chair shall be instructed to present forthwith, on behalf of the committee, a report to the House outlining the material facts of the situation. 6, the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council shall assess for redactions proposed by the government pursuant to subparagraph 4 to determine whether the office agrees that the proposed redactions conform with the criteria set out in subparagraph 4, and A, if it agrees, it shall provide the documents as redacted by the government pursuant to subparagraph 4 to the clerk of the committee, or B, if it disagrees with some or all of the proposed redactions, it shall provide a copy of the documents redacted in the manner the office determines would conform with the criteria set out in paragraph 4, together with a report indicating the number, extent, and nature of the government's proposed redactions which were disagreed with to the clerk of the committee. And 7, the clerk of the committee shall cause for redacted documents provided by the office of the law clerk and parliamentary counsel pursuant to subparagraph 6 to be distributed to the members of the committee and to be published on the committee's website forthwith upon receipt. J, order the production within 3 weeks of the annex to Special Rapporteur David Johnson's first report, together with all documents reviewed by him in preparing his first report, provided that 1, the documents shall be deposited without redaction in both official languages with the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel. 2, the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel shall promptly notify the committee whether the office is satisfied that the documents were produced as ordered, and if not, the chair shall be instructed to present forthwith on behalf of the committee a report to the House of Commons outlining the material facts of the situation. 3, the documents shall be available for reviewing by committee members under the supervision of the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel between the day of their deposit and the day prior to the meeting referred to in subparagraph 4. 4, the committee shall meet in camera for at least 2 hours, no fewer than 14 days after the documents have been deposited, but no later than Friday, September 8, 2023, with relevant government officials to discuss the documents. 5, at the meeting referred to in subparagraph 4A, only committee members, support staff required for the meeting, the witnesses, and representatives of the law clerk and parliamentary counsel be permitted to attend, and B, the clerk of the committee shall provide numbered paper copies of the documents at the beginning of the meeting to committee members who are present in person, which shall be returned to the clerk at the end of the meeting, and the clerk shall destroy the numbered paper copies after the meeting. And 6, during the viewing referred to in subparagraph 3 and at the meeting referred to in subparagraph 4, no personal, mobile, electronic, or recording devices of any kind shall be permitted in the room, and no notes may be removed from the room. And K, order the production within 3 weeks of all records concerning the expenditures incurred or committed to by the Special Rapporteur pursuant to paragraph 4G of the Schedule to Order in Council 2023-0324, including contracts with Tories, LLP, Navigator Limited, and Orchestra, provided that the document shall be deposited without redaction in both official languages with the clerk of the committee. 2, the document shall be distributed to the members of the committee and published on the committee's website forthwith upon receipt. And 3, the clerk of the committee shall promptly notify the committee whether he is satisfied that the documents were produced as ordered, and if not, the chair shall be instructed to present forthwith on behalf of the committee a report to the House outlining the material facts of the situation. So now, Madam Chair, that I have read into the record the motion that I am bringing forward, I wish to make a few brief comments about the substance of that motion. Madam Chair, since the start of this study, we have heard from ministers and officials in this government and from the Prime Minister's rapporteur. Taken together, their testimony has resulted in far more questions than answers. We have a former Minister of Public Safety who is now the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, who gave evidence to this committee that was outright contradicted by the director of CSIS. We have a current Minister of Public Safety who was unable to answer the most basic questions, including what happened to the issues management note that warned that MP Michael Chong was being targeted by the Beijing regime when it breached public safety. That minister couldn't even answer whether he had instructed his department officials to find out what happened to that IMU. We have a government led by a prime minister that are never responsible, that are always conveniently never briefed, that always cast blame on others, whether it be CSIS or whether it be public servants. And we have a rapporteur, the Prime Minister's long-standing family friend, who was unable to defend key conclusions in his report and appears to have not been given complete information by this government. And it's very interesting that we heard today from Mr. Cooper, formerly of Global News, who noted that an NSICOP report in 2019 raised concerns about PCO withholding certain documents from NSICOP. So it certainly raises questions about the transparency of PCO and this government. And we have a rapporteur who is tainted by conflict layered on top of conflict, undermining his independence and the credibility of his findings. This is a rapporteur who has, for decades, known the Prime Minister, who was a member up until his appointment as the Prime Minister's rapporteur of the Beijing-funded and Beijing-compromised Trudeau Foundation, who hired as his chief counsel a major Liberal donor to help write his supposedly independent report, a rapporteur who hired a recent former Liberal ministerial staffer to be his spokesperson, and we most recently learned that this rapporteur hired the same crisis management communications firm. Imagine that, a rapporteur hiring a crisis communications firm, but I think it speaks to the utter mess surrounding his appointment. This rapporteur hired the same crisis communications firm that was advising a member of Parliament who he was tasked with investigating. In the face of all of that, what is needed, very clearly, is a public inquiry. Canadians deserve one, and Parliament has called for one 3 times. And 3 times, this Prime Minister and Liberal MPs across the way have thumbed their nose at the will of Parliament and continue to do so, and some of them were just nodding now. All the Prime Minister has offered is a fake rapporteur, a family friend, to buy time to issue a report that the rapporteur couldn't defend, didn't understand, and that amounted to a whitewash of a Prime Minister's record of turning a blind eye to Beijing's attack on our democracy in 2 federal elections under his watch, and that has targeted sitting members of Parliament in an attempt to impede their ability to do their jobs, to speak on behalf of their constituents, and to vote freely in the House of Commons without they and their families being targeted and threatened by the Beijing regime, and not to mention a Prime Minister who has repeatedly turned a blind eye to Beijing diplomats and upper officials targeting the Chinese-Canadian diaspora, including turning a blind eye to intelligence reports that warned him of the activities of Zhao Wei, allowing that diplomat to freely target and intimidate Chinese Canadians for 2 years, and then only when the Globe and Mail blew the whistle did the Prime Minister finally act and, after considerable pressure, send one diplomat packing. No, not thanks to anything that this Prime Minister did, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs, for that matter, did, who claimed when she came to this committee that she had no information about any such activities. Patently false. And so, at the end of the day, until the Prime Minister calls a public inquiry, this committee is the only public forum where these issues can be studied to get to the bottom of Beijing's interference and to get the answers that Canadians deserve. And that is what this motion provides for. It provides for the calling of key witnesses to committee, the production of relevant documents, and a continuation of hearings over the summer, because very simply, this is a matter that is pressing, that we cannot afford to shut the hearings down for 2.5 months. We need to continue to do our work, and that's a very key element of this motion. And so I am hopeful that members on all sides recognize the importance of producing relevant documents, calling key witnesses, and allowing this committee to continue to do its work over the summer. And I hope that it will receive the support of the members of this committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I have Mrs. Blaney, suivi par Madame Goudreau. Mrs. Blaney.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I just think we should get to the vote, so I'm calling the vote.
As I have Madame Goudreau on the list, I'll just need to go to her, and then I'm sure we can call the question. But now Mr. Berthold would like the floor. So, Madame Goudreau.
Madam Chair, if I fully understand, we have resources here till 1:30. I have a question, though. We had a very good meeting with witnesses this morning, and don't forget we started at 10. It's still official for tonight, so we have 2 hours to discuss Mr. Cooper's motion. I'm asking you this question, Madam Chair. Am I correct? Yes, but we also have time now to discuss it, to begin the conversation. Yes, of course. But you have to understand that each time we have 5-hour meetings or 3-hour meetings, we've never gone beyond 1:15. Really what we want to do is to be productive. We want to be able to share our ideas. We want to be productive for the meeting tonight. But over the course of what's in between today, we have other tasks to accomplish. So if we go around the table, well, at 1:15, we can just adjourn the meeting until this evening. Yes, well, that's exactly what we're going to do. But if we can have a vote like Ms. Blaney asked for, Mr. Bertoldo has asked for the floor. But if we have other things to do, but right now we do know that we have resources here at until 1:30. At 1:30 we must stop, but then we will know what will be happening. So we have 25 minutes left. Well, I'll give the floor to my colleague, then put me down on the list. On the same motion, you don't want a vote? I can't vote right now. I have a lot to think about, but I feel like I'm being pressured here to vote. I don't know if my colleagues think like I do. This is a long motion. What hasn't been understood? People say, well, wait till Friday. Well, look. People have to put their big boy pants on, and they have to sit down and do the work that has to be done. We have been dealing with this since November 7th, 4 months at least. Look, if people can look me in the white of my eyes to say, okay, this is it, you have to vote, you're pressuring me. We wait till the very last minute, and I think that you are just making a mockery of our voters here. If you look at social media, each of us follow it, and I met someone on the weekend that says, look, do you have to ask the same thing and repeat the same thing every question, period? Well, I think it's going to take 250 years before anything is clearly understood here. I will continue to speak. I'm not ready to vote. I believe that we have to take the time. It's been 4 months already, and we're meeting again tonight. So I'll let my colleague speak, and then I'll put myself down on the list again. Thank you, Madame Goudreau. Mr. Berthold. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. There are a variety of elements today that I wish to acknowledge. I want to thank Michael Cooper for working with his team to bring forward this motion, and that gives us a complete view, and that follows on the House order that we got to look at interference in the case of Mr. Michael Chong. I want to be very sure that people who are listening to us and watching us on TV are, as my colleague Madame Goudreau said, know where exactly we are and on foreign interference. There has been a resignation from the House, further to the opposition party's request, the special rapporteur, and there has been a variety of issues that have been hotly contested. Nonetheless, I could say that the government is doing everything it could to prevent further interference by Beijing's government in coming elections. We don't know. But in my colleague's motion, there is a very relevant part, which is point A, which deals with expanding the scope of this study further beyond Michael Chong's case. And it deals also with the question that was brought up by the Honourable Erin O'Toole on Tuesday, May 30, 23. He was briefed directly by CSIS on what happened. He was the first member to receive a complete briefing. And here we have heard intelligence experts tell us, experts from CSIS and other national agencies, tell us what type of information is circulating. You've got the raw intelligence, you've got the more refined intelligence, and so on. But Mr. O'Toole was the very first one to have all the information. He was careful in the House to summarize the information that he had received. He voluntarily retained kept back certain information that he felt might be harmful if he shared that information with the other members of the House. So Mr. O'Toole exercised judgment, but he does have other things that he could share with our committee. He should be here for at least 2 hours. And on the same question of privilege that was brought up by Mr. O'Toole, that is to say that he was a victim targeted by Beijing. He heard a ruling, no, perhaps not a ruling, but a decision, a ruling by the Speaker of the House on the matters that were brought up by Mr. O'Toole in his question of privilege. The same thing for Madame Kwan, the NDP member of Parliament. who did not bring up a question of privilege on that matter. It was her right to choose. But it is necessary. In fact, it is essential that officially this committee broaden the scope of its study to include the issue brought up on May 30th in the House by the Honourable Erin O'Toole. And having heard Mr. Cooper's testimony today, I think that is even more so. There are many answers that Mr. O'Toole could give the committee. I think it's extremely important that the committee therefore hear him. Secondly, that the motion mentions that the committee should continue to sit over the summer period. Why? Because, well, foreign agents don't take holidays. They continue to adapt, to adjust their methods of work. And as long as Canada doesn't have stronger legislation to prevent Beijing from interfering in our elections, they will do so. So how can you justify to our fellow citizens when we have been discussing the interference of Beijing in our electoral system in 2019 and 2021, how can you justify if you suddenly take a break and go home? And do you think people will accept that? No, people won't accept that. It certainly will not. It will not be accepted. There has to be the agreement of the Prime Minister to have an independent public inquiry. We have to continue our work. That public inquiry has to be available to people to come to hear what has happened in the past. The two national security committees that have been so often quoted here in committee, they meet in private, in camera. So if it weren't for the journalists' revelations and for this committee that is trying to shed light on the situation, we certainly wouldn't have the opportunity of knowing what has happened and what is happening. Without the journalists, we wouldn't have known that there was a diplomat that was expelled because he intimidated a member of parliament. We would not have had police stations, Beijing's police stations on Canadian soil. There are still places where activity is ongoing. They are not all closed. This is something that has to be explored further in an inquiry as well. And Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, the Prime Minister wanted to extend the shroud of blackness, the cloud, over this matter as long as possible. Why? It would seem that everything was being done to prevent Canadians from having access to information about foreign interference. In these meetings that have been held since July 4 to 8 September, this is what is requested in the motion. 8 meetings. That's 8 meetings would be held to deal with foreign interference. I have already mentioned Erin O'Toole, but we do also have to call other witnesses. Mr. Leblanc, who was there to represent the rapporteur, to talk about the process. And I want to point out that the leader of the opposition has said that we are ready to discuss the terms of reference of public inquiry. We are ready to have a discussion on the commissioners, but the Prime Minister has to clearly announce that there would be a public inquiry that would be independent, and then things will fall into place. We'll move very quickly. We will be able to have a commissioner appointed, and we'll get down to the bottom of things. That's the only thing we're really asking for. We ask Mr. LeBlanc to develop a process so that there can eventually be an independent public inquiry, if it's too much for the Prime Minister, to be able to remove politics from the whole process. We are ready to cooperate. We want to work on the mandate of an independent public inquiries commissioner. We are ready to do all of that, but before submitting names and ideas with respect to the remit, to the mandate, we want first to hear the Prime Minister commit loudly and clearly to an independent public inquiry. So, we want Mr. LeBlanc to come here and tell us why there has been no movement towards setting up a public inquiry. That is why we want to hear him. Is there something to hide? And also in the list of prospective witnesses, there are a lot of people who might have been witnesses, might have written newspaper articles to enlighten us about what has been said, what has happened to memos from CSIS. There's all kinds of memos, I don't recall exactly the name of a memo, but there are memos that say that this memo is intended for the minister's eyes only. This is a matter of internal management and in terms of national security and intelligence. Those types of memos are drafted expressly to attract the attention of the cabinet members, the ministers, and the Prime Minister. They're not a lot, 2, 3, 4 or 5 or even 6 a week, but how can it be that these memos have disappeared? They've dropped into an abyss somewhere. And why weren't Cabinet and the Prime Minister alerted about this? When we want to hear Mr. Johnston and the witnesses who work, all those who work in security and intelligence seem to know about Mr. Johnson's proposed work. We want to hear Mr. Blair. We want to hear many others. I have to say, I think it's very important that we have these people who come before us, the deputy ministers, the special advisors, the national security advisors, the undersecretaries of cabinet, and the chief of staff, and Madame Zita Astravas in particular, who seems to have played a role in this process, chief of staff to the President of the King's Privy Council for Canada. We want to hear them as quickly as possible. The public expects that. And the special rapporteur, it would seem, even hired a firm to question witnesses to help him draft his report. And there were external consultants that were hired. Often, if he were unable to not remember his own words. Many people in the special report were people who were advisors to the special rapporteur who came from an outside agency, representatives of firms who represented one of the persons who was targeted in this inquiry. And also there is Brian Top, co-founder of GTN Co. This is a person who was a volunteer advisor. We need to hear all these people. So further to all these revelations, Madam Chair, we learned that the Minister of Foreign Affairs had a list of diplomats that had been submitted to her by CSIS for possible expulsion because these were diplomats from Beijing who were exercising pressures in Canada. The list was given to the minister, but we don't know what happened to the list. What did the minister do? We are very proud, we hear, to know that there was, in fact, a diplomat that was expelled from Canada. But what about the list? Melanie Joly, Madam Minister for Foreign Affairs, where is it? This is a list. Did she have the list at the time that she appeared before our committee or not? She should come back to explain this to us. And also, I think that it's well worth the time to have Mr. Kong Hu, who is the ambassador of the People's Republic of China, before us. If you could come here to transparently answer questions, I'm quite convinced that all parties would have very good questions to ask him. So 2 hours is, I think, for a meeting with him, it would be a bare minimum. Obviously, the legal advisor, Madame Sheila Bloch, she was the special advisor to our special rapporteur, should appear as well, so that we fully understand the whole process. Why? We want to understand why the special rapporteur, who supported his own report right to the very end, why did he resign? But she remains in place. So she's going, or he's going, but he's going, but I'm going to stay in place. The report has to be finished. What credibility does that give the whole process? It's really, what credibility Canadians, the House of Commons, all members of the House of Commons have to have credibility. And so you have the special rapporteur who is paid a sum of money, maybe $1,700 a day or more to finish a report. Well, and we have Mr. Blair, who should come again before us to explain what memo was given to his department. A memo that apparently never was seen by the Prime Minister. Was that voluntary? Was it involuntary? Was it because of a member of his cabinet? I don't know. But for all these witnesses that I have mentioned, it is very important for us to meet this summer. I would have a great deal more to say about the information that has not been made accessible to us as a committee from the very outset. I'm talking about documents. There was a motion that was adjourned, which asked for the production of papers. Papers, documents that are absolutely essential for us to fully understand and to see clearly the extent to which Beijing interfered in our electoral system here. But unfortunately, we didn't get all of them. So we got some that necessary, and it doesn't make much sense. I don't know why the Liberals and the NDP are reticent. Why do they not want us to see the documents, even though the law clerk of the House has said to us that it could be organized in such a way that we could see the documents if the motion were to be adopted, and that he could organize it so that they could be kept confidential. They could be given back to him. My colleagues from the Liberal Party seem to sow a doubt about the articles that were published by Sam Cooper. On the basis of those articles, part of them were handed over during the first handover of documents, but it seems that they were based on reality. They seem to be compliant with reality, because in fact there was a diplomat that was expelled. So those documents contain information that is important and which really should be shared. You've seen in Mr. Cooper, my colleague's motions, that he wants the information that could be harmful to national security, that could be harmful to our relationships with our allies in other countries, should be protected. So we don't want to break the trust, the links of trust that we have with our allies. I think that this motion is excellent. It is beautifully written, and it lays out the way in which we as a committee should proceed to obtain information that could be made public, but it also would give us access to information that should not be made public, but which could be seen by the members of this committee through a process where documents would be printed for the eyes of members of this committee only, where they would have no electronic equipment with them, and where they would have to be paginated, numbered, and given back to the clerk after having been read. Any document that could threaten public safety would not be transmitted to the members of Parliament. And that is the reality, and that is, in fact, the beauty of my colleague's motion. So we have a motion for the production of papers here, which, to my mind, really merits the support of each member of this committee. The House legal law clerk came to appear here and explain the way in which we should proceed to be able to view documents. And a motion, therefore, was crafted that really, I believe, meets all the concerns that members of this committee might have about the importance of protecting secrets, but which would also allow us to have some access to information. So to conclude, Madam Chair, I would like to say one thing. Our Committee on Procedure and House Affairs offers the pathway to achieving our goal. So we don't want to have to use 116.4 to have meetings all summer. I think my time has run out. Madam Chair, do I have time?
I'm adjourning this meeting. We'll see you at 6:30 tonight. Thank you.